text is how they say it is, then they're right. But if it's how we say it is, then they're wrong. See? Yes?
That's what the Catholic Church is based on. How easy was the transition then when the English king said, I am king of the church and the Pope is nothing?
Yeah, so that really wasn't an easy transition. That's the fun part about the English Reformation. It wasn't much of a Reformation. It was a lot of crazy stuff. Yeah, it wasn't very easy, and it also was. It was also a when you have the king and you have the entire government kind of just flip like that. I mean, the people that didn't like it, it didn't end well for some of them. That's why they had a lot of wars eventually that went on. The whole English situation is very interesting. There's actually, I don't remember which month, but there is and I can't remember his name now. And I did a thing about it at the seminary, but he is in our commemorations actually.
Robert Barnes.
Who?
Robert Barnes.
Yes, Robert Barnes. Thank you, Robert Barnes. Yes, good. You know. Yeah, Robert Barnes was a martyr. He's commemorated in here on commemorations, a martyr in England when the English did their Reformation. He was a Lutheran, and he was burned along with Catholic priests. So they took some Catholic priests, and they took Robert Barnes and another Lutheran pastor, and they burned them all together. They didn't like either one of them. So there was a push, really, there was a big push during that English Reformation time to appeal to the throne and the court to say, hey, you're gonna be doing this Reformation. Let's make it. Let's have a Lutheran Reformation here, right? Imagine that reality where the English Reformation became a Lutheran Reformation. That'd be crazy. But of course that didn't happen. And at that time when they killed him, it was that weird. It was pretty much Roman Catholicism in almost all the beliefs at the time, except having the Pope. That was really it. It took a few you get a decade or so after, and you start to move on, and you get a new Archbishop of Canterbury, you get a new monarch, stuff like that. Well, then it shifted into transitioning the theology of the Church of England into being something different. It was a lot more Calvinist, and they went up and down. It went more Calvinist. It got really reformed like that with Calvinistic tendencies, and then years went by, and it kind of, you had the monarch flip, right? Whenever you got a monarch in that was Catholic, then it was Catholic, then it was Anglican, then you had your a lot of your stuff like Puritans and Separatists and all that kind of stuff came from within like Church of England stuff. John Wesley, the Methodists. Well, Methodism came out of Anglicanism. A lot of stuff that came out of that. So imagine the difference if it would have been a Lutheran Reformation. That would have been something. But yeah, so this whole text thing didn't really matter when King Henry VIII did his whole thing. It was just a political thing. And since the government had their power and they were doing what they wanted, I mean, you had theologians that made claims like the Roman Catholic priests definitely were sitting there saying, oh yeah, look at there's authority right here. Were they pointing directly to the scripture? Maybe. Were they also just pointing to the fact that Rome had a lot of power? Probably too. So they made their claim, and then they got killed for it. Wars broke out, and then Lutherans also made their claims, probably not using this text, and they still got killed for it. So it was just kind of chaos over there. That's the best way to describe the English so-called Reformation. Terrible. It was just chaotic. It's hard to even pinpoint. That's the thing, is you can kind of flow pretty well with us. Kind of flow a bit on, okay, this thing, and even with the John Calvin, you can kind of flow a bit. But when it comes to the English Reformation, it's like here and here and here and here and here, and you don't even know what's going on. So, yeah, but good question about that, because you would think such an important text with Rome that would cause a problem. It would seriously cause a problem, right? And it kind of goes back as well, even like during the Reformation with Luther, and how you were dealing with this text is you still had the theologians were still not doubting that it was the confession of St. Peter, right? It was just they were placing more emphasis on the person of St. Peter at that point. And so that kind of, that examination of this, and seeing also where like throughout the early church, where that kind of came in and how long it took for that to become the primary view. Because when you look through, you see like you had, and I can't remember all of them, but you know, you had your patriarchs. So you had your Bishop of Rome, and you had Jerusalem, and you had Constantinople, and you had Ephesus. Ephesus, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Rome, yeah. You had those, and so for a while, you know, these patriarchs, they would work together on a lot of stuff. They would come together. They would, I mean, though they bickered at times, right? They still recognized that Rome had like this ceremonial view as like a first among equals kind of thing, right? And that was no problem. People didn't really have a problem with that whole first among equals. And even within the Reformation, like us, like technically what Lutherans believe is the seat of Rome, as in like where a bishop could be, is that technically like a valid position to be the Bishop of Rome? Yeah, it is valid. It's valid. It's just that seat, that bishopric seat has gone astray. That's the thing, but it's still a valid seat. Same with like the Eastern Orthodox. They'd say, well, Rome's gone astray. They still recognize the validity of the position of being the Bishop of Rome in that same way. So you had for a while, you had this idea, you know, they worked together and they made decisions. They didn't just make a decision arbitrarily without the other ones and stuff like that, until you started to get a little bit later on, especially within like 600s, 700s, 800s especially, stuff like that. You started to see a very big development in Rome establishing itself as being superior in all ways to the other patriarchs. Especially by the time you get to the turn of the millennium, they've really made that clear, and that's when soon after you get the split between East and West over a large number of things, but a lot of it came down to Rome and them believing to be superior in every way, shape, and form to the other patriarchs. Therefore, all of them had to submit. That's where the issue. It's really the turn of the millennium where things started to get really, really, really nasty politically with Rome. You can see it a little bit coming up, leading up the centuries before, but really when you get to that millennium, that's when it started to get kind of wacky in that area. So, yeah. But so Confession of St. Peter and the person of St. Peter, you can see where it really was the confession that was preeminent for most of the history of the church until the person himself, St. Peter, was then overemphasized. And that's usually how it went. A lot of these things started where, like, when you see things like this, where the right view was going for a long time, and then a little bit crept, you know, you got a little bit of stuff creeping in. It was kind of like, okay, you got like accretions of this and this and this, and it all kind of comes together probably around, if I could put a year to it, I can't really, but I'd say leading up to that to 1000 AD is when it starts to, when that really takes a big shape. So, all right. I know I kind of rambled about Rome and history and England and Peter and confession and all that, but are there any questions or does anybody have a comment maybe they want to say about this? Or
well, you are on a soapbox, so you're allowed to kind of ramble on.
You're right. I'm on a soapbox. I have the mic. But yeah, no, I could ramble on forever about it. This could be how my sermons are. I could just ramble like, hey, today's oh, in this reading, you would? Yeah. Well, I actually wrote like part of a sermon and gave it in my homiletics class with for the commemoration of Robert Barnes. So I talked about, like, you know, I can't remember what the text was, but there was a text that went with it in one of the LSB companions they have that has like some of the text for commemorations, and there was some martyrdom text. So I kind of just talked about martyrdom and used Robert Barnes as the example, and it was really cool. So when I'm ordained and I'm somewhere and Robert Barnes day falls on like a Wednesday or a Tuesday or whatever, and I'll live stream a small divine service about commemorating Robert Barnes. And you can witness a sermon where Henry VIII's mentioned. There you go. Negatively, of course. That'd be great. Okay. Any other clarifications, questions about Confession of St. Peter? I think it's pretty obvious how we differ from Rome, right? In that way, yeah. And how it's developed over time and all the points. And you can really see this is a big, like a lot of the books, like if you read, like I have a friend that converted from Reformed Baptist to Rome. And so I read some of the books that he was reading, right? And that's one thing they do. They do a real, like if you go to I would go to Catholic Supply to buy stuff, just because they have a large array of items, especially like the clerical collars and stuff like that. And they have so many books that are like, hey, like come home, like, welcome home, Rome Sweet Home, or Home Sweet Rome, or something like that. I'm like, ugh. I'm like, why do you have to have that name that rhymes with that? You get people picking up that book and start reading it. They have a lot of books like that. We don't have a lot of that, do we? Mainly because they have a lot more resources. But yeah, when you start reading those, almost every single one of them within the first like 2 or 3 chapters, this whole St. Peter kind of thing in the rock, that's a very, very big issue that gets brought up almost immediately. Because once you bring that up and once you're able to make the point that, yeah, it is on him, that the papacy was founded right then and there and it is on him, well, once you get that established and you're all in on that, well, then everything else is going to usually flow naturally from that. Because then you're going to say, well, if that's the point, then it has to be this next. Like, yeah, everyone has to submit to this. Well, you see what I mean? Like that, if they get that point established really quick, then it's fine. They know that they've knocked down barriers, they knocked down walls, and they can say a bunch of other stuff, and you kind of just say, well, the magisterium says it. Duh, yeah, that means it's fine because Christ founded the church solely on, Peter, the first pope. So, yeah. He was Bishop of Rome, though. I will say that. He was a Bishop of Rome and a Bishop of Ephesus. So he actually was. That's the thing, though. He was Bishop of Ephesus first. So why isn't Ephesus the seat of the papacy? Oh, no. Then they go, well, no, like you don't understand. Oh.
Doesn't rhyme with home.
Exactly. Yeah. See, if it was Ephesus, then they'd really be lacking book titles. And that might saved a few people from going over to Rome, and that's a big issue. Like I said, my friend converted, and the big issue is because most people, the vast majority, are going to be like your really hyper evangelical people that it's easy to skip over like Lutheranism and other stuff like that and immediately look over at Rome or the East, and since those groups, I'll just say those evangelicals, they lack. And I didn't grow up Lutheran, as most of you know. I grew up I wasn't anything, but I grew up going to non-denominational churches with friends every now and then. And I went to Baptist church. I've been to Mormon services. I went to Seventh-day Adventist services. I mean, every random Church of Christ, all this other stuff, right? And when you lack the law and gospel being properly divided, and especially you lack the sacraments being present, right? You're lacking 95 to 99% of that Christian identity. And when you don't have that there, most of the time, if you're not just stuck and ingrained in it, if you just read anything deep in the Bible or in church history, you're gonna go somewhere else. You're gonna go Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran, or Anglican. Those are the big ones. And most of the time, it's Rome that grabs people because bigger, all that kind of stuff, more resources, and that tends to be the case. That's what happened to my friend. But that it always starts with this whole St. Peter distinguishing the confession. And yes.
I got
Yeah, I have to actually get a. I don't have a list actually right now, but I know in my my recreational reading of it, a lot of the early church fathers don't really speak too much to it clearly on Peter himself. I have to get a list. There's a handful, but they start coming up like late 200s, early 300s and after, but like your early 100s, early 200s don't spend much time, at least the stuff we have on it, talking about that. I'll get a list though. I'll get a list because I had one back in like first or second year at the seminary. I just don't know where it's at. I'll have to find it. We have a class that talked about some stuff, so I ended up putting stuff together for it. And I should have found it, but I didn't look for it. So yeah, I will find that list. But especially later on, like especially like your kind of end of the church father kind of time, I guess, like when you're getting 500s or so. Like I have the Faith of the Early Fathers, that 3-volume set. And in the third volume, when you start getting into late 400s, early 500s, then you start to see a number of people start saying that. That's only, of course, in the West. In other areas, you see it turn completely opposite. They're like, no, it's you're first among equals, stuff like that. They cite a lot of stuff like the canons of the First Council of Nicaea, because the canons of the First Council of Nicaea, one of the canons kind of says that a bishop, his jurisdiction is all he can kind of work within. So he can't go and say, well, this bishop over here, like I'm going to appoint a bishop over in this area, or I'm going to put a priest over here, say this or do that kind of that is another bishop's jurisdiction. So one bishop can't interfere with that. And so that was cited a lot whenever Rome started saying, well, I want this person to be in Constantinople as bishop. When they started saying, I want this, or they started saying, well, and a little bit northern, when they started moving into Germany, they were like, well, we're going to put bishops here, and we're going to do this. They were like, whoa, wait a minute. We all came together at the Council of Nicaea, and one of these canons says, you have your jurisdiction, and that's it. And so that started to become a big hot debate around your 500s-600s as well. So I'll get a list about that though. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, we're gonna move on because we can beat the Confession of St. Peter over and over again, but we're gonna move to someone else. We're gonna move to an Old Testament figure. It's commemorated on January 20th. Sarah, wife of Abraham, and ancestress of the Messiah. So I'm going to read from my little red book, not Mao's little red book, but I'm going to read from this good little red book. All right. Just when some might be thinking about a bit of blissful retirement, Sarah's big adventure begins. She and her husband Abram had never been blessed with children. They doted a bit on Abraham's nephew, Lot. He was, Sarai must have thought, the nearest she'd ever come to having a son. But then God speaks to her husband, and their entire life is turned upside down. She learns that she's moving. Where? God would let them know when they got there. She learns that God has promised that she and her husband would have children, though up until that time, Sarai was barren, unable to bear a child. She also learns that God intended to give to her offspring the land of Canaan, where a child born of her lineage would bring blessing to all the families of the earth. She even got a new name, Sarah. It was all a bit much to swallow, but she followed her husband obediently. Walking together in faith, they learned that the living God takes delight in doing what seems to our minds to be utterly impossible. That is how he teaches his children to trust his promises, not their own wisdom, and receive from him every good thing. But this walk is not a single, steady ascent. It's no victory march. It has its ups and downs. Sarah knew them all. When famine sent them into foreign lands, her husband, in fear and doubt about God's protection, passed her off as more than once as merely his sister. God intervened, and Sarah's honor was protected. As the years passed and no child appeared, Sarah suggested that Abraham should take her maid and have a child with her. Abraham did so, but again, God intervened and showed that this was not how he would keep his promise. It wasn't until every earthly avenue had been closed to them that the Blessed Trinity appeared and announced the fulfillment of the promise within the year. Sarah, hiding in the tent, couldn't keep from laughing upon hearing the announcement. She was old and saw no way she'd ever conceive. God, though, had the last laugh as Sarah miraculously conceived in her old age and gave birth to a little boy. They named him Isaac, which means laughter. God hadn't needed them to figure out for him how to keep his promises after all. Sarah laughed again at how everyone would join her mirth at this most ridiculous situation. What is impossible for humans is never impossible for God. Nothing is more certain than his promises to us. Sarah learned this and laughed with delight. We remember and rejoice. All right, so who all knows about Sarah and Abraham, right? I'm just going to assume everybody knows that, right? Yeah. Sarah and Abraham, of course, had their names changed to that. But what I want to ask is, it mentioned the maid, right? So tell me, I want somebody to tell me what was kind of the story? What happened here with of course we read part of it. Sarah couldn't give birth, right? Too old. Abraham and Sarah were too old, and that was something to laugh at when God said, hey, you're gonna have a child, right? Yeah, that's a joke because I'm too old. But what did Sarah have Abraham do? What did she want him to do since she thought she couldn't have a kid?
Have a child with the slave girl or the
Yeah. Who do you remember her name?
Hagar.
Yeah. And do you remember who came from that union? Ishmael, right? And so, is anyone familiar with this? How it's seemingly like, okay, like you're reading the narrative, right? And Ishmael comes from that, and you have Hagar and Ishmael, and then you have Isaac went from what God actually wanted, right? And then Ishmael and Hagar sent away and all that kind of stuff. And you don't really hear anything. Like after that, it's like, all right, you had Ishmael from that and whatever. You had a son that was done in a way that God didn't intend. And then you go really far ahead in history, like really, really far, like after the birth and death of Jesus Christ. And Ishmael takes precedence again. Anyone know where?
Islam.
Yes. Anyone know how Ishmael takes precedence within Islam?
They believe he was the son of the promise.
Right. So there, if you read through that and you look, right, Muhammad claimed that he was a descendant of Ishmael, right? And so they would look back at like this text, right, and they'd see instead of Isaac being so important, rather Ishmael was the important one here. And that's a big basis. And you have a lot of people that actually believe that. I have a professor at the seminary because we talked about that, because we went over the story and talked about that. And he says no, like there's no way there's any connection. Even people who disagree with Islam will say, yeah, like they have a connection, and that's kind of like a usually it's these people that say like this is a prophetic connection almost, because Ishmael was conceived by out of a union that God did not want, God did not intend. Abraham and Sarah went out of their way to scheme up something that God had not planned or intended. And so when Ishmael came from that, well, that's like that was wicked, right? So then you fast forward in time, and of course Islam came from that. There's a connection because you go all the way back, and there was this wicked point. And I can see people make that point. And then I have a professor that made a point where it was like, that's just them trying to find legitimacy within the ancient, like within ancient religion like that, because Islam, as you know, when they talk about the Abrahamic faiths, right? Well, one notable Abrahamic faith is a little bit after, it's considerably after the other stuff, and it's considerably different to both of them in a lot of ways, right? So that was kind of a legitimacy thing, I think. That was probably more so like, hey, look, I don't want to be left out. I'm legitimate. Here, Ishmael is is where I can trace it back to, and kind of a heck of a guy to trace it back to. That's why they had to make it kind of a new narrative when dealing with Sarah and Abraham. Yes?
Didn't God say to Hagar and that her son would become a great nation?
I don't know the words that are he says something. I have to look. I'm going to look real quick, actually, because he says I don't think he says that, but he says something like they're not like they're sent away, but there's kind of like there's not like this totally like 100% like negative connotation that's given completely. So here, let me look. I'm gonna look. While I'm looking, does anybody have any comments about Sarah? Was Sarah 100% doing God's will in this? No, right? So she's another example. Still, I'm sorry, do you have a question? Yeah.
Can we address the incest issue in this?
With the sister thing?
Yeah, they're literally, and the verse says that she's the daughter of his father, but not his mother.
Right.
That wasn't common in ancient Canaan, was it?
You know, it wasn't. It's one of those things where it was not common, but not. It was kind of that rode the line. It actually kind of rode the like right on the fence of a common and uncommon kind of thing. Actually, when you start to get further, like after like, oh man, I did a thing on this too when we were going through the kind of this travel through Genesis and everything. The incest thing is kind of strange because Genesis covers such a large amount of like a time span, like the biggest time span of any book, right? So like you see areas where it's like, oh yeah, they're doing this, and then you get further on in Genesis and it's like, oh no, like at the end it's like there's not really a place for that anymore. And the thing is it was one of those like it was not common and not uncommon at the same time. It was kind of like it was kind of developing into being more of just a it was kind of a taboo thing, if that makes sense. It was very strange. One of the things I read was like once you had like the Phoenicians in some of the other groups, there were some things that were done that were like anti-incestual things, which means that what that shows is when you're getting that point where there's like an anti thing, that means it became prominent enough, right? That's more of the stuff you start to see. You don't see as much like, hey, this is what's happening. It's more like in a positive way. It's more like you start to see, oh, this is like an edict against doing it. You start to see that developing, which, like I said, means it had to have been going on enough to make a point against it. But it doesn't really get addressed too much. Just like it was like oh yeah, it was just that's kind of like the early time, and that was developing, and it's like I think Pastor might. Did you guys sit in on all of or a lot of what Pastor his sexual ethics class? Did he talk about? Did he bring that up at all?
We got into incest at all.
No? I guess it wouldn't be like a thing like, hey, here's a. I guess that would have been something good to bring up maybe, because I know he brought up polygamy.
We didn't get into the polygamy lesson.
Right. Oh, you didn't? Yeah. Well, he was gonna, because you see that, you're gonna see that in the Bible, of course, too. And it's one of those things that isn't expressly talked about, but still it's obvious the consequences of polygamy are clearly usually like 99.9% of the time a negative thing that comes out of it. Except you see like the quote positive things are going to be really, really, really early on in history, especially like the development of civilization and stuff like that. But once you get further on, you kind of it gets seen as like don't do that. That's problematic. The incest thing I think is even less talked about. It's just kind of it's not prevalent past Genesis, really, in anything. Yes?
I think probably it was not a topic because it's not controversial.
That's really, yeah.
Everybody thinks it's bad. So we didn't, it wasn't.
Well, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say it's before the pre-Mosaic covenant.
Yeah.
If you go all the way back to Noah, his sons had to, or the sons and daughters of Noah's children had to marry someone. The
Right.
one that's going to be available is their sister.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was a point in time when it was not against the moral law.
Right, yeah, it was a necessity thing that existed. Yeah, and being pre like Mosaic in that way. That's like that's the thing is there's so much that went on prior to that and how it developed. I mean, that just wasn't made clear because by the time of that, things were well established, right? So now it can be clearly put down. This is that, right? But early on, yeah, it had to be somebody had to marry someone at that point, and that was a big deal. Of course, then you get into the whole thing with with Lot. You may know Lot and the daughters and stuff like that. Well, the daughters feared that when they were wicked, right? But they had feared that there was no one else. Like there was the whole like everything's over and we need to continue the human race. Lot knew after the fact, right? This is obviously bad for two reasons, and it's very much said in the Bible this is bad. Of course, to continue on everything, Lot ended up getting raped by his daughters to continue on the race, right? The human race. So two bad things happened: rape and incest. And they're both looked down at that point when that narrative's going on. Both the rape and the incestual part are very negative. Because then you have the offspring of those daughters and the negative implication that comes from that kind of purposefully and wickedly incestual thing that was done. Yes. There was.
Oh, I was just thinking everything's good until it turns bad. And that's kind of what happened because in Genesis 16, Sarai, she gave Hagar to Abraham. So, everything was fine until Hagar then, when she got pregnant, then she had contempt for Sarai, so that's when it became bad. She got, there was this rift.
All right, and then you look back, but then it looks back on it, and it also is like, well, they still went out of their way. The God didn't command it, right? So,
But then he started his protection, and that's what I think Ben was
Yeah.
saying. And then later on, he did protect him. He did say that her line would multiply too.
right, like it wasn't like that he was completely condemned. Like they were not both completely condemned, right, in that way. Well, you can also see something like not expressly commanded, but done all the way in the New Testament when Judas kills himself. Well, they were like, well, we need a 12th apostle, right? So they cast lots for who would fill in that role. And then later on, you have Paul come in. So then it's like the debate is who's the 12th apostle? Is it the one that they cast lots to get, or is it Paul? Some places will actually have like a 13th apostle, right? Because they don't want to knock the one that got in by lots, right? But see, that's another example of something being done that wasn't commanded directly by God, but it's still like when Matthias got in after getting in, being the 12th apostle decided by Lot. He wasn't like, God didn't go like, oh, like I'm going to kill him now because he got put in a way I didn't command to be put in. No, that didn't happen. So it's in similar fashion. Yeah, God didn't want and commands Sarah to kind of coax Abraham into getting with Hagar and having Ishmael, but he didn't just immediately just kill Ishmael and Hagar because of that action. You can kind of see two examples there of people doing not what God, not going expressively against what God, because there was not really anything said, but rather not waiting and listening to what God was going to say and taking matters into their own hands. That's what you see there. You see two examples of that. But still, you have the story of the hospitality, the Abraham's hospitality, stuff like that, with how Sarah, how Sarah was. She was very hospitable to strangers, things like that. She, there's always the thing with these saints that we look up, through, whether it's Advent, which we'll get to in December at the very beginning, all the way up through now, right? Yeah, there's these negative qualities that exist still a lot from them, right? I mean, Sarah's in the line of the Messiah. Goes all the way back. She's a very important figure. She was there. I mean, she's in the narrative a lot, right? And still, at the end, she honored God, and Abraham and Sarah gave birth, continuing on that line, and God was still honored even after going against and doing something that wasn't commanded. She still was faithful and honored God, faithful to Abraham too. So she was a faithful, and that's why she's in here. She was a very faithful woman. We're all faithful, but we still fall short, right? So she fell short, but still you see her faith shine through by still going through giving birth and doing what God commanded. I mean, you could say like, wow, she was impatient or something, right, for saying, Abraham, go and do this. But if you think like she waited for a long time. They waited for a very long time. So still, in the end, she was a faithful person. So that's something we can read in the narrative and see and kind of glean from. All right. Is there anything else about Sarah? Anything kind of a yes?
If people are living to be 500 years old, how come they're still like aging out of things by the time they're 80?
I'm sorry. You said if they live until.
Yeah, if they live until they're like 500, how come their childbearing years don't extend to the same proportion?
At this point, how long? I actually don't. When did God limit the whole?
During the flood. It was pre-flood.
Yeah.
Pre-flood, the lifespans were longer.
Right.
Post-flood, it was pretty standard.
Yeah, and you had like, I don't know. I don't know why 1 year, why a certain year it got limited, like to the childbearing thing.
Well, and pre-flood, the birth ages were, they were having children in their hundreds.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it was a lot later on. Yeah, I'm trying. It's also, I try to wrap my head around like being 500 or something. It's like, it doesn't say, right? It doesn't make it clear as to why some of those years. For some, I guess it's different because some like we still have some people that are a certain way when they're how when you look at someone and you're like, wow, that person's like 90 years old and they look pretty good, but then you have somebody that's like 40 or 50 and I'm not being mean, I'm just saying that like people age differently in a certain way, right? That was still the same back then, but instead of like you get up to your 80s, you were getting up to your 400 and 500s. So just put into that perspective, right? That's one of the really mysterious things I think that still exists pre-flood. Everything pre-flood is kind of mysterious, but I looked into that a lot. You get a lot of like people can come up with like different like scientific reasons, like Answers in Genesis or something does a whole thing about it, like oxygen levels and like or the firmament, right? Like with the firmament and the waters coming up from the ground and the firmament, all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of cool if you ask me. So that's probably it probably has something to do with the whole firmament kind of thing. I don't know a whole lot about it right now, but from when I remember reading a lot about that when I was like right before I went into the seminary, like right when I was getting confirmed, there was a lot I read on that because there's a lot of speculation. Everything antediluvian, so pre-flood is like, I'm going to speculate on this because I don't know. That's the vast majority of it, but I'll look and see if there's anything anyone says as to why, because I just haven't looked. And then I'll let you know if I see anything that people even like speculate on. So, all right. Anything else? Yes.
Do you want to finish that Ishmael point? Because the two references to what God would do for Ishmael, 17:20, Genesis 17:20 says, I will make him fruitful, multiply him greatly, he shall father 12 princes, I will make him into a great nation. And then he reiterates it in 21:13 says, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I did say I was gonna go read it. Sorry, I forgot to look back. I'm sorry. I got distracted by something. I don't know. The incest thing. The incest thing distracted me. Sorry. Yeah. Well, did you go over this a little bit in your? Because I know you're going really quick through the whole 2-year Bible thing, but was there anything that discussion about?
Just real high level.
Okay.
People do foolish things, and God can bring good even in spite of it.
Okay.
And that's the repeated theme over and over that you see
Yeah.
throughout the Old Testament.
And that's the thing is, you can get like 300 examples, right, of the Old Testament, different person, different place, different setting, and still that's the example you're gonna.
And the other point would be that rather than God having to make a rule for everything that is wrong, like incest is wrong, polygamy is wrong, all this, he sets up the perfect model, what you should shoot for, and if you keep your eyes on that, then you know to stay away from these other things. His model laid forth in creation before the fall was a man shall leave his mother and father and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So he lays it out. One man, one woman, lifetime marriage is the prescribed model, and that's the perfect one. And it's reiterated when you see Christ and his bride, the church. So we show that and living by that model.
Right.
So then you don't have to address every single aberration. You can't, because man will come up with some new way to mess it up.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And also you have every example as to why. Like instead of actually addressing it, you just have the stories of the people that you, like I said, you see the stories of the people that engage in that stuff.
The natural consequences
And
that flow from it.
Yeah, that's the lesson itself. It doesn't have to be a command. It's just, oh wow, like this person did that. Oh wait, 100 people did these examples, and they're all negative. Yeah, that's probably a bad thing. Yeah, exactly. That's the lesson. Yes.
So back with Ishmael, so God did promise that he would become a great nation. So when Hagar was running away from Sarai, God promised to Hagar in Genesis 16:11 that Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. That sounds like Muhammad to me.
Yeah, probably is. Yeah, it. You know what? Could be. I don't have any problem with it being that. Absolutely. It's interesting. Yeah, there is like a lot that's said about that, isn't there? Yeah. I don't even know where you could, if there's anything else scripturally that really goes in on it, right? I mean, from Hagar, you did have the whole with the Arabs and all that kind of stuff, and hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Yeah, you do see that whole thing where like the progenitor of the Arabic people with Hagar, and yeah, so I mean, it could very well be such a thing, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's something I want to read more about probably and see, just so I can be more solid on such a thing. But all right, anything else on Ishmael and Sarah and example we can take? Nothing. And we kind of went over that pretty good. So we have 5 more minutes of this. So the next, let me make sure who I have next. Next person, January 24th, is St. Timothy. So we're back in the New Testament with our feast. So I'm going to read again the article here on St. Timothy, and at that point we might be close to wrapping up. So we'll get through this and see. So the festivals of St. Timothy and St. Titus cluster around that of St. Paul's conversion. So you'll see this is St. Timothy we're going over, and then the next one after that is the conversion of St. Paul. We all know about the conversion of St. Paul, but there's some interesting stuff we can learn from that kind of gets to, kind of sideline. You don't really see it talked about too much, but because there's a lot that goes in there, and you kind of just remember the oh yeah, Jesus appeared, and that's that. But it's kind of a cool little narrative. So that's in between St. Timothy and St. Titus, the feast for them. So this is most fitting, since both were close companions of the great apostle to the Gentiles. They labored with him to preach the saving gospel. St. Paul first encountered Timothy on his second missionary journey. He soon took the young man under his wing as pastor and missionary in training. St. Timothy had a Jewish mother, but his father was a Greek. In order to use him most efficiently for the ministry that St. Paul envisioned among the Jewish communities, he circumcised him. Despite his previous lack of circumcision, his faithful mother Lois and grandmother Eunice raised Timothy in a faith-filled home. Though and Lois and Eunice are in the commemorations somewhere, I can't remember. Even the chapel below in the seminary, below the main chapel, there's like a little tiny chapel. It's the chapel of Saints Lois and Eunice. So you know. They raised Timothy in a faithful home. They loved the word of God and had carefully nurtured the lad in the faith. They had taught him the promises and songs of the Holy Scriptures. He knew the story of God's people. Paul would later praise this godly heritage that shaped Timothy. From childhood, you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. From 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. St. Paul's great love for Timothy, whom he called his son in the faith, resulted in the 2 letters in the New Testament that bear Timothy's name. These crucial writings provide us with invaluable information about the shape of church life during the later apostolic age. In them, we see that each local community had a pastor who worked with others to oversee the life of the congregation. These men above all labored in teaching and preaching, but they also administered a lively ministry of mercy together with deacons. They were like St. Timothy, to devote themselves to the reading of the word of God so that they could rebuke and comfort with full assurance. The early tradition of the church suggests that St. Timothy was with St. Paul in Rome when the great apostle was at last beheaded for his unwavering confession of Christ. Afterwards, St. Timothy is said to have returned to Ephesus in Asia Minor, there serving as bishop until he was also granted a martyr's death toward the very end of the 1st century AD. So when we come back together next week, next week will be, I don't think there's anything going on. Next week there shouldn't be. When we come back together next week, we're going to go deeper on St. Timothy, and then we're going to jump in with conversion of St. Paul and St. Titus. But when we start going over these, now that we're actually getting into these saint figures from the New Testament, we know that we had the colors in the LSB about the ones that were martyred, the ones that weren't. We're going to discuss some of the stuff with the martyrdom of them, because it's not, you don't see the stuff talked about with, like in the scriptures itself with their martyrdoms for the most part. But there is some stuff like right after early church writings about how some of these people were martyred and some of the stuff they were doing, and there's some really interesting stuff we can glean from that. How active they were, how faithful and active they were. I can't remember who it was, but one of the apostles, and we'll get to it. One of the apostles, disrupted. He went in. There was a procession for one of the Roman gods. I can't remember who now. I'll get it and I'll say it next week. But he disrupted that procession, and in doing so, he was martyred from doing so. And that was there was an early church thing about that. But yeah, what we're going to do is we'll read some of the texts that surround them, kind of the readings for the lectionary around some these saints, and then we're going to get into their life in the full that we know, because we hear about them, we know about them, but then we're going to get specifically into some of the stuff that you don't hear a lot about them, like how they were martyred, because the vast majority of them were martyred, all but one. So we'll get into that and see how they remain faithful even unto death, and the stuff that Christ said about such a thing. So and it's time as of right now, so let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for bringing us all here together, that we can gather around your word and gather around the examples of the saints that have come before us, Lord. Thank you for giving us all these examples throughout history that we're actually able to see their lives and see just how they showed forth the faith in you and how that's really shaped history as a whole, leading all the way up to us now, Lord, saints in your church. Bless us as we continue on throughout this day, and bless us as we ponder on all these things that we learn about these various saints, that they may shape our lives in many good ways, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.